Hi, welcome to Courageous Journeys. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today. So, privilege. We've been hearing a lot about it lately, especially in particular, white privilege. What do you notice coming up for you in your mind or in your body when you hear that? White privilege. For a lot of people, white people in particular, it can bring up a sensation that doesn't feel good. It can bring up a sense of fear or anxiety, uncertainty. And there are different reasons for that, depending on your own personal history. But part of that we as white people collectively tend to feel is a sense of, privilege. It doesn't feel good to think of ourselves as being privileged. It can actually bring up, or the reason that it doesn't feel good is because it can bring up a sense of shame. And I talked about shame a little bit in another conversation on race and how shame kind of plays into that. But the idea of white privilege can end up bringing up a lot of things that feel similar to other types of wounding and even shame that we might be holding on to. So I wanted to take a little bit of time today and talk a little bit about privilege, not just white privilege, but privilege kind of generally, to really be able to better understand what white privilege really is or means in our own personal lives. So I'm going to talk about 5 different aspects of privilege. And I'm sharing this with you to help anybody be able to really go beyond the surface of the words and connect to the truth, the reality of what privilege means, what it looks like, what it even feels like. So again, white privilege is something that's being talked a lot about. And I will share a couple of links in the description for some resources that you might find helpful. I don't have any connection to them. I'm not making any money off of them, but just a couple of things that I think can help expand an understanding. So I looked up the definition of privilege to start. So I'm going to read that to you, and I would encourage you to, if you can, just close your eyes and listen. So this is just a definition of privilege. There's no specific privilege associated with it. It's just the idea of what privilege means. And as you listen to it, just notice what comes up. Maybe you have a feeling in your body. Maybe you notice a thought or an image that comes to mind. So what is privilege? Special rights, advantages, or immunity granted or available to a particular person or group. I'll read that again. A special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available to a particular person or group. So maybe you didn't really notice anything. Maybe you were just listening to try to see if that definition makes sense to you. But if you did notice anything, and I think for a lot of you, there's probably something that came to mind. Maybe a sense of feeling your own privilege around something, or maybe a sense of all the ways that you are not privileged. Because all of us, in some aspect or another, probably are a little less privileged than some other people in some way. And this is why it's important to really understand what privilege is and why it matters that we are able, as humans, as individuals, regardless of race, regardless of anything else, why it is important for us to be able to recognize that. So if you're feeling any sort of anxiety, if you're feeling any sort of shame that is present for you, try to take a deep breath and remind yourself that in this conversation especially, there's nothing to be ashamed of. When we understand more of our privilege, when we understand more about the rights that we have that maybe other people don't, it's not something to be ashamed of. When we're able to recognize that, we can then be motivated and moved to actually creating more equality, more kindness in the world. But if we feel that feeling, it causes us to shut down and try to avoid anything that can make us feel that. So, ready? All right. So, as I said, there are about a handful of ways that I'm going to talk about in terms of privilege, because white privilege is very real, but there are other types of privilege that you might be able to more easily recognize or see it as privilege without any sort of fear or shame associated with it. So, one of the first ways that I'm going to talk about privilege is in physical ability. So I've made some notes, so I might look down at my notes a couple of times because I don't want to miss anything here. But physical ability. For those of us that don't have physical limitations, whether it's a significant limitation like missing a body part, the ability or not having the ability to walk, or even just having full mobility within even your neck. A lot of people have neck injuries, right? And you notice a difference between if you've had full mobility in your neck and then you don't, you see a pretty significant difference. So in physical ability, so you may have an actual physical disability, or you may have an injury that never healed properly. But for most of us, we have some sort of physical ability that allows us privilege as we move through the world. Think about your day. If you have the ability to physically move in the way that you need your body to move, you don't even think about it. You get up in the morning, you put your feet on the floor, you do what you need to do in the morning, and you go on about your day. You walk to your car, you get in your car, you walk to the subway platform, you maneuver through your day, you get up and you sit down, you walk, you climb the stairs, you pick up the phone, you type. So many ways that our physical ability causes us to be privileged. Think about opening a door that doesn't have the automatic, like wheelchair accessible where it opens on its own. The ability to just so easily, without having to think about it, open the door. Well, what if it doesn't have that? Or what if you're a quadriplegic and you don't have the ability to move your arms? Or what if you have an injury, you're holding something in this arm and this arm has been injured and you can't open the door? The assumption that anybody who needs to can open that door exists, right? Otherwise, it would open in a different way. Doesn't mean that there's something wrong with that necessarily. It doesn't mean that the person who can move in and out easily has anything to be ashamed of. Not at all. But it is helpful to be able to recognize, especially when we're talking about privilege, and I also think gratitude, but it's helpful to see the reality of our day-to-day life in how we do experience privilege. So, what I wrote down for physical ability is ease in access to most public things. So the door, being able to go into a restaurant and be able to maneuver through tables. Well, if you have some, even something like vertigo, for example, if you're struggling with vertigo and you're having to maneuver through something, that can make it quite challenging. But for somebody that doesn't have vertigo or any other sort of limitation in terms of their movement, you don't even think about it. But that place is set up for people that can maneuver without any concern about how their limitations or how someone's limitations may keep them from being able to do that as easily. Even when you think about the things that we need in our daily lives, those things are designed for people that have ability. So if you think about even a toothbrush, right? So a toothbrush is designed for somebody who can grab a hold of a toothbrush and move it around. Well, what if you are somebody who, for whatever reason, doesn't have use of your arms or doesn't have the dexterity in your hand to hold a toothbrush? Arthritis sufferers, particularly rheumatoid arthritis sufferers, have a lot of difficulty with the ability to really grab a hold of something. So what do? So those of us who can hold a toothbrush without even having to giving it a second thought, we have privilege in that. We have an ease of knowing that whatever we need to do, we have access, easy access to being able to get that. At least that it's available to us. Now, whether we can easily access it might be a little bit different, but we know that there are hundreds of choices for a toothbrush. If you're somebody who can't hold a toothbrush, your choices are incredibly limited. Again, doesn't mean that we need to feel shame or feel embarrassed or defend ourselves because we can easily hold a toothbrush. Not at all. It just means that it's helpful to be aware that there are people, maybe even people that we love, who don't have that ease and ability. And when we can acknowledge our privilege in that, it helps us and it helps them because we have more understanding. Another area of privilege that most of us take for granted is cognitive ability. Now, obviously, we all have different intellectual ability and levels and that kind of thing, but most of us have the ability to process. We have the ability to read, even if we don't necessarily read very well. But our world is set up with an assumption that people have the ability to read and they have the ability to process what they're reading or what's going on around them. And for some people, it's not quite that simple. And there could be any number of reasons that somebody might struggle. Maybe they never learned to read, but maybe there is a cognitive issue that keeps them from being able to read. Even dyslexia, for example. But maybe it's something more significant. Maybe there are some other issues going on that causes somebody to not be able to fully process what they're taking in, whether it's through reading or visually, what they're experiencing. But again, the world is set up for those people who can easily take in information, who can read information and take it in. Everywhere you go, there are signs that you have to be able to read. There's paperwork that you have to be able to read to sign. There are a lot of things that we take for granted that we're able to do that somebody who can't read has to really not only struggle more with, but plan things out more. If you've ever been to a foreign country and you don't speak the language or read the language very well, it doesn't feel very good, does it? Everybody else there is just going about their day because they can read everything. They know what the traffic signs mean or the street signs mean. For those of us who don't speak the language, it's a lot more challenging. Does it mean that the people that can read should feel badly about it? No, of course not. But having the internal awareness that that isn't something that's available to everybody, but yet we make assumptions that everybody can read. We make assumptions that everybody can read and process and fully grasp and comprehend what it is that they're reading. And we do that because we're human. Doesn't make us wrong. It's just what we do as humans. And this is why privilege is something that's important to understand, because it is our privilege in our ability, cognitive or physical, that allows us to move through the world without having to think about that. Another area of privilege, and as a woman, this is one I've been very aware of, is gender privilege. And in most countries, males go through the world with a lot of privilege. And that's true regardless of race. Race can certainly play a role, and if you're white and male, it's certainly different than if you're black and male or any other color, really. But being a male certainly has privilege in pretty much every part of the world. So again, privilege is an inherent thing that you have. It's something that you don't necessarily have, or you don't really, it's not something you achieve. It's really generally something more that you're born with. Now, there are some other examples, and I'm actually going to talk about one in a little bit. But for the most part, it's things that we don't really have control over. If we don't really have control over our physical ability, our cognitive ability, we certainly don't have control over our gender. But being male gives you a lot of privilege. So I made some notes about some of the different ways. There are a ton of different ways. Even with cognitive and physical ability, there are a lot more than I talked about. With men. Okay. So as somebody who talks all the time about abuse and sexual assault, one of the big things that men might have a lot of privilege around without really giving it any thought is a certain, like literally they don't even have to think about it. If they need to go out for something, they don't have to worry, or generally, the thought doesn't really cross their mind. Am I going to be safe if I go out? Do I have my whistle? Is it okay to leave my drink? Is it okay to wear this? Is somebody going to think something if I wear this? Men generally do not leave their home with an understanding that every 2.5 minutes they might be sexually assaulted, because every 2.5 minutes a woman is sexually assaulted. And while women don't consciously necessarily think about that, it is a reality that we know exists. Men have the ability, because they are men, to not really have to have that in the back of their mind. Now, I'm not saying that men are not sexually assaulted. They are. But the comparison in terms of how frequently that happens is very small compared to women. Women are, part of the reason that it's on women's minds, why it's part of our consciousness, is because we are also blamed for it. So we do have to, not that we have to, but we do find ourselves thinking about what we're wearing, thinking about being alone versus with a group of people. We have to think about whether it makes sense to leave a drink on a table with a group of people or not. So that's one aspect of privilege for men. And again, I want to make it clear, it doesn't mean that men aren't afraid of other things or that men are not, again, sexually assaulted, but it's not generally something that they concern themselves with. They generally don't have to worry about walking down the street and somebody coming up and grabbing them or making rude, suggestive comments to them. They don't have to think about that. Now, does that mean that they should feel badly because it happens to women? No, they shouldn't feel badly personally. They shouldn't feel ashamed of that or embarrassed by that. Hopefully they would call somebody out for doing it if they saw it, especially if it was a friend or something. But they themselves should not feel bad, like they've done something wrong because it happens. Another way that men have natural privilege is in a workplace. Men still, and again, I think that this is true for most countries, men are more likely, by their gender, they are more likely to get a more kind of prestigious title or job and more money even for the same job because they're men. It's as simple as that, just because they're male. Again, that's not something that a man needs to feel ashamed of, but an awareness of that can be helpful. If a man moves through the ranks quickly, he's generally not concerned that people are going to think that he slept his way to the top. But a woman who moves up the ladder, even not all that quickly, it's an awareness that we have that people aren't going to think that she made it because of her ability, her intellect. A first assumption quite often is that she got it some other way. It's not something men typically have to concern themselves with. Again, doesn't mean that men need to feel embarrassed about that, but an awareness of that is helpful because it can help change the dynamic in a workplace, whether that's a very small workplace or a really large corporation. If men understand their privilege that's baked in, so to speak, then when they have a woman who maybe is a new hire at a managerial or above level, he pays a little more attention to his thoughts. Maybe he listens a little more closely to what's happening around him and the conversations that are happening. And maybe he does say something if there are some rude comments made. Maybe when she gets a promotion, he's very intentional because he's got this awareness. He's very intentional about when he congratulating her and maybe being able to say something along the lines of, "You really earned that." And even for women, a female coworker to be able to say that as well. If you have gone to a business and have some sort of problem with it, if you are a male and you are coming in and talking to customer service or talking to somebody about the concern or problem that you have, your concern is more likely to be taken seriously than a woman. Of course, that's not true across the board at every single business, but that is a reality, that tends to happen. Women are not taken seriously when they have a complaint about something, one of the things going way back, and it still happens, is women can be seen as irrational or having a bad day. And often, there have even been jokes, but they're not really jokes. They're actually very condescending and rude things about, like, well, she must be on her period if she's pissed off about something. Well, maybe she's pissed off because you're an asshole. But those kinds of things, like a man, if a man is in a bad mood, it's because somebody did something wrong to make him angry. If a woman is in a bad mood, it's not taken seriously. And men are treated differently in businesses. There was a situation in my personal life, this has been a while ago now, and I don't remember exactly what the circumstance was, but it had to do, I think, with car repair stuff. And it was my car, so I was the one making phone calls or whatever. I took care of my car. Well, I took care of having things done to my car. But I made a phone call. I don't remember what it was about, but I felt like the way that the information that I was given, or the number that I was given, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I came away feeling like I wasn't taken seriously, or they were trying to take advantage of me. And I was talking to my husband about it, and he said, no, that's not the case, that's not what happened. And he wasn't being rude about it or anything. He was just saying that he didn't think that that's what happened. And so I asked him to call. So he called and got a very different response. That is a reality. I believe, and I could be wrong about this, and it's been a while since what I'm thinking about was a while ago. Women often pay more for cars than men do. And I think that was true even for female car saleswomen, that they would still lower the price more for a man than for a woman. So now, does that mean that a man should feel bad because a business takes him more seriously than a woman? No, we don't want a man to feel bad about that. We don't want him to feel ashamed about that. There's nothing for him to feel ashamed about. But if a man has that understanding, well, he might, in his own business, behave a little bit differently. But he also then is more conscious, more aware when he is interacting with a business owner or an employee in a business. Another aspect of privilege for men is that people generally are not going to ask a man in his, let's say 30 years old, they're generally not going to be asking him when he's getting married. And that's true for both family, friends, and strangers. They don't tend to ask that kind of question as much of a man. They definitely don't ask the kinds of questions like, well, when are you going to have kids? Or do they actually have an expectation that he will have kids, that he must have kids? And so the privilege in that is that when you go see your family and you're single as a 30-year-old male, your family at Thanksgiving dinner is not likely going to be saying, so when are you getting married? You know, your clock is ticking. But a woman who is not married or doesn't want to be married or doesn't want to have children, or even if she does want to have children, she knows that there's a good possibility, with family especially, that those questions are going to be asked. And if she says, I don't want to get married, or I don't want to have children, or I'm not sure about having children, she's likely to be grilled about that. So how is that privilege? Well, it's privilege because it's not something that you have to worry about. It's not something that takes up space in your mind. It's not something that creates anxiety in your body when you think about going to spend a holiday with your family. So ultimately, there's less stress. There's more enjoyment. There's less shame because you feel like you're being judged. So again, nothing for them to be ashamed of. Nothing for men to be ashamed of in any of this. But the awareness that women experience these things is important. So, white privilege. Check in with yourself and see how you're feeling. Reflect and see if you can notice what kinds of things have come up. Are you aware of some of your own privilege? Are you aware of your own disadvantage in some way? A disadvantage doesn't have to be a bad thing or a negative thing specifically. It certainly doesn't have to make you feel better, nor should it make you feel bad. But I think being able to recognize both our privilege and areas where we may be disadvantaged can be helpful on both sides for different reasons. But noticing what comes up for you is important. No matter which side you're on, there is no shame in either one. Not at all. So take a deep breath and let's continue. So, white privilege, the reason that I really am doing this video ultimately. So, one of the reasons that white people, and this is a general statement, obviously not all white people, but one of the reasons that people who struggle with the idea of white privilege struggle is because when you hear white privilege, it can make you feel like somehow you think you're better. It can also trigger a sense of having your accomplishments minimized or devalued in some way. And that is not the case. One thing that I saw about white privilege, and I don't remember the exact quote, it doesn't mean that your life hasn't been filled with struggle. It just means that your color was not one of the things that you struggled with. And that is a reality, not only in the US, but other countries as well. And certainly if you are a white person and you grow up in a predominantly, in a neighborhood that is predominantly a different race, whatever that may be, of course there are going to be some things that might disadvantage you in some way. And I'm going to give a couple of examples here. But overall, in life, in society, there is a ton of privilege that we as white people hold without having done anything, just by the nature of the color of our skin. We have privilege. I, as a white woman, have a lot of privilege. I, as a white woman, have less privilege than men, generally speaking, and certainly white men. In some ways, I have more privilege than black men, but black men have privilege that I do not have. And the same is true for brown men. Whatever race it is. But when it comes to white privilege, if you are white, you have privilege. No matter how you grew up, no matter how difficult your life may be. There are particular circumstances that the nature of the color of your skin gives you privilege that other people who are not white do not have. That is not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to feel badly about. Again, it's about an awareness of that reality. So, I'm going to give you another personal example. When I was in high school, I believe I was a freshman. I don't remember for sure, but when I was a freshman in high school, I went to a high school that technically I should not have been able to go to because I lived in a different area. I lived in a different district. But all my friends were going to this high school because I also went to a grade school that technically at certain points I shouldn't have gone to either. There was a while that I lived in that district, but I had moved out. But my grandparents lived in that district, and they lived in the same house my entire childhood life. And we moved around a lot. So when I went to high school, I went to the high school in the district that my grandparents lived in because, in part, we did move a lot. We got evicted a lot. We couldn't afford our apartment quite often. So I moved a lot as a young person, and my mom wanted me to be able to stay at the same school. So we used my grandparents' address. And here's another point of privilege. There is a woman, probably way more than one woman, but there is a Black woman who was arrested and sentenced to jail or prison to serve time because she used a different address so her child could go to a different school. I'm going to talk about that too in a moment. But anyway, that's part of the privilege, the story that I'm sharing. So my mom drove me to school when we had a car. Otherwise, I took a bus or I stayed with my grandparents so I could take the bus to school, the public or the school bus to school. But one day my mom dropped me off and I walked in about the same time that a bus got there. A bus full of, I believe, almost, if not all, almost all Black students had come in on. Black students, by the way, that happened to live very close to where I lived. And this was during a time that they were, it had been happening for a little while, but they were taking students from different areas that did live in other districts and busing them to different districts. So this bus arrived from about the same area where I lived, full of mostly, if not all, Black students. So they were walking in. I walked in as well. There were like a lot of doors. It was a wide, very wide space. But I walked in on this side and they walked in kind of mostly in the center. And as I walked in, I don't remember exactly what was said, but there were students already in there who said, or a student said something along the lines of like, go back where you came from, or you don't belong here, or something. I don't remember exactly what was said. And in that moment, I was filled with fear and shame and sadness. Because I knew that technically I didn't belong there either. I lived near them. But because I didn't come in on that bus, because I was white, it was assumed that I belonged there. The term white privilege was not really used at that time. I don't know when it really became a very widely used term, but I'm a little older. So this was in the early 80s, very early 80s. But in that moment, I felt the fear that, oh my God, What if they knew that I didn't belong here? I felt the shame of not belonging there, not being somebody who had the financial wealth that the other students who belong there had. I felt sadness because of the pain that I know my classmates felt in that moment and probably felt every day. But the shame is what really got to me. It was a reminder, because I already knew that I didn't belong, but it was a reminder that I didn't. It was also a reminder that I could, as far as they were concerned, that I could pretend my way through it. And that wasn't conscious. I wasn't deliberately doing anything to make people think that I belong there. But by the nature of this color of my skin, people assumed it. Now, the people that I was kind of most connected to, I guess, in my class, they did know that I kind of was an outsider in terms of the middle to upper class school that I went to. They knew that my financial circumstances were quite different. And so there was always that piece there. But even though that was something that caused me to not belong there, to look at me, you didn't really know that. Now, I didn't wear designer jeans and expensive shoes and stuff like that, but that wasn't something that was easily recognizable. And while people did pay attention to that, it wasn't something that was identifiable like that. It wasn't identifiable when I walked in at the same time as my Black classmates. And I didn't call it white privilege. I didn't know that there was a term for it. I didn't even know that it was something that existed all the time. But in that moment, I recognized the benefit that I had because I was white. I still felt the disadvantage of not being middle to upper class. I still felt that sense of not belonging and even shame. But at least I wasn't also feeling, I didn't have the color of my skin being an indicator that I didn't belong. And that's a reference to the idea that I shared just a few moments ago about at least the color of your skin is not something you have to consider. So some other ways that white privilege can show up. So again, this is in the US and other countries, many other countries as well. But as a white person, so I'm speaking of countries that are predominantly white or areas that are predominantly white, anywhere you go, you're going to be in the presence of mostly white people. And when you are in the presence of mostly white people, there's an automatic sense of belonging. If you are somebody that is not white in an area of predominantly white people, you always know that there's something about you that doesn't fit. And you know that I talk about the importance of connection all the time. Well, if everybody around you, without even having to know what they think or believe, looks so different from you, especially as a child when you're trying to get a sense of who you are, you feel like you don't fit. You can also feel afraid because if any of us as humans, when we go into a situation with a lot of things that are unknown or unfamiliar, it naturally makes us feel a little uneasy. So as a white person going into a place, you're likely going to be surrounded by people who look somewhat like you. And if you're a woman, you know what it feels like, right? To walk into a place that is mostly men. It can feel a little uncomfortable. Even if you're not afraid specifically, there's just kind of this sense of knowing that you're the only woman. When you, as a white person, again, in predominantly white cultures or societies, as a white person, when you achieve something, the people around you are going to believe, at least for the most part, that you did it based on your, that you've earned it in some way. Now, going back to the gender thing, if you're a woman, depending on what it is, there may be a little bit disadvantaged there, but still not nearly as much as if you are a Black person or a brown person. So there's an expectation, an assumption that you got it in the appropriate way, not because somebody was trying to fill a quota, not because somebody needed to create a more diverse staff or less diverse staff. Even as a woman in some male-dominated fields, women often will feel like they are being hired, and this is kind of a double-edged thing. They often feel like maybe they're being hired to fill a sense of what they believe it should look like, even if the people don't really want to hire them. One of the most significant things, especially right now, that I think is maybe a little bit easier for white people to understand is that as a white person, when you see a police car behind you, now unless you were speeding or you're a criminal, you're not likely to give it a whole lot of thought. You might check your speedometer just to make sure you're not speeding, but you're likely not going to give it a whole lot of thought. And even if you are speeding, you might think, oh, damn it. And you pull over, you don't give it a whole lot of thought. Okay, I'm going to get a ticket. That sucks. Well, as a white person, that's a whole lot of privilege. Not just privilege in the reality of the experience, but privilege in the freedom that you feel inside to not immediately fear for your life. Because Black people, and we hear this all the time, and I've heard it personally, but we hear it anecdotally all over the place. Black people, in particular, when they see a police officer, when they see a police car in their rearview mirror, it's not just checking their speedometer. It doesn't, whether they've done anything wrong or not, doesn't matter. That panic sets in. I've heard people share that they have a moment of, am I going to come out of this alive? I don't know about you, but I don't know any white person who has ever come across a police officer or a police car or been pulled over who one of their first thoughts was, am I going to come out of this alive? And again, not just the reality of coming out of it alive, which obviously is really important and significant, but the ease that you feel in your body or the panic that you feel in your body. And yes, if you get pulled over for speeding, you might still feel a lot of panic about that. But there's a huge difference between panic of getting a speeding ticket and your insurance going up than panic of potentially losing your life. That is privilege. watching movies, reading books, television shows. As a white person, we have an assumption that, and it's not even a conscious assumption, which is why it's privilege. We have an assumption that the people are going to look and sound like us. And when they don't, you notice it, right? When everything that you see around you are people, are experiences that people that don't look anything like you, or experiences that you've not had ability to experience, it reinforces an idea that you're alone in the world, that you don't fit in, that you aren't meant for, that you're not deserving of or worthy of those things. As white people, we are taught by the things that we're exposed to, even if nobody says it directly, we are taught that there are no limits to what we can achieve. Now again, as women, this is slowly changing, but as women, we are taught that we can't really achieve everything. But we still see women, white women, who have achieved things. We see white, like even thinking of like Leave It to Beaver. We see a white woman who has a nice life with a nice husband and nice kids in their nice home. So even if we don't have that, because I certainly didn't have that, yes, white people, but I didn't have a father at home. I didn't have dinner on the table at night. I didn't have a mom that stayed home and wore an apron and cooked for me. But it was still an idea. Potentially, I could become that woman because that's what was put in front of me. Now, my socioeconomic status also added to my belief that I couldn't really do that, but that's a different form of privilege. Being raised middle class, upper class, certainly has its own privileges in many ways, no matter of race as well. But when we are able to see, no matter what we're looking at, people that look like us, it changes things. It changes our sense of acceptance and worthiness in the world. So, should we as white people feel ashamed of that, about the privilege that is given to us by the color of our skin? Should we feel embarrassed, ashamed? No, we shouldn't. That's not helpful. But we do have a responsibility to ourselves, not to mention to other people, but we have a responsibility to ourselves to understand that, to recognize how our privilege affords us things that are not available or not easily accessible to people who are not white. And if we can do that, if we can release any shame, any fear of losing some of that privilege, then we can create or be a part of creating in all our aspects of privilege. We can begin to create a more inclusive world, a world where we all experience less shame. Because we experience less shame, we can become gentler, kinder people. where we create a society where everybody, no matter their ability or color, knows that they matter just as much. The other privilege that I wanted to talk about is not something that is inherent, that we are born with, or inherent in our being, born with anyway. And that is zip code. So zip code, in what I'm referring to, is more about the privilege of wealth. And when I say wealth, I don't mean extremely wealthy, but the wealth of our family and community. So I don't know how it is in other countries, so I will only speak to how it is here in the US. In the US, our school systems, our public school systems, are set up to be funded predominantly by local and state or local tax, property tax and sales tax. So if you think about that, the zip code that you live in is likely where you shop, it's where you do business, maybe even likely where you work, or at least near your zip code. If the money put into a community, into a zip code, is what funds public schools, then naturally a zip code that doesn't have as much wealth, doesn't have as many businesses that collect sales tax, doesn't have properties that have higher property taxes, those schools are therefore going to have less money than a school in a zip code where there are high property values, therefore high property taxes, more businesses to collect taxes, more businesses that mean people go there to do their shopping, which obviously is more tax money. But in communities where there aren't a lot of businesses that are going to draw people in to do shopping, then obviously it limits it even more. So the zip code in which a child lives impacts their education significantly, because the funding, the financial resources available to a school impact teacher salaries. It impacts, now that doesn't mean that they have worse teachers necessarily at all, but teachers already make very little. So generally speaking, a lot of teachers want to make a living. They don't want to have to work a second job. They don't want to have to buy school supplies for their students. Well, in a wealthier district, the school is going to supply more things to their students because they have the financial resources to do so. So what happens often in a more poorly funded school is that they may have some great teachers, but the teachers tend to not stick around very long because they have bills to pay. So if they can go to a school district that they can make more money, generally they're going to want to do that. And that's not something for them to feel badly about. That's something that needs to change at a systemic level. So teacher pay, the kinds of activities that children have the ability to do at school, both in terms of classes and in terms of playground equipment, right? If you go to a school in a district or a neighborhood that is lower income, and then you compare that to a school playground in a wealthier district, there's a difference. And there shouldn't be. That's so unfair. That's so unjust. But that is the reality. Extracurricular activities, there are far fewer in lower income neighborhoods and schools. The expectations that are put on students in lower income schools versus higher income schools is vastly different. And what I mean by expectations in this particular circumstance is that when you go to a higher income school, more well-funded school, teachers, school counselors, your community has an expectation that you can do anything that you want to do. You can go wherever you want to go to school. You might not get into your top school, but you can go to a really good school. You might even get grants and scholarships. You might have a really great athletic thing, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, in a school that can maybe afford you to get a scholarship. So the expectations that are put on students is that they can achieve anything that they want. Now, teachers in lower income schools, principals, they know that that's true for those students as well, that they are capable of all of that. But the reality is that what's available to them is going to be more limited. Yes, they can get some scholarships or grants, but technically they tend to not get quite as many. Or they might be more likely to be, maybe not more likely than a wealthier school, but if you happen to be a great athlete, then you might be able to get a scholarship that if you're not a great athlete, maybe you are at a disadvantage in terms of physical ability, then maybe those scholarships are not as easily available to you. So the students take that on, that people don't expect as much. They don't believe in what is a possibility for them. Textbooks. Students often in lower income schools have old, outdated textbooks that are missing pages, sometimes not enough textbooks. That is not okay. That is not okay. And the reality is, going back to my privilege, my mom knew that going to the school in my grandparents' district afforded me a better opportunity than if I had gone to the school in my neighborhood. Now again, part of it was because we moved a lot and she didn't want me to have to keep changing schools, but there is no doubt that that was something that she realized as well. I didn't realize that as a child, but I do now. So, should students who go to a higher income community school feel shame because they get to do that? No, of course not. But is it helpful for them to understand that not everybody has that ability? Yes, absolutely. It would actually help when children are younger, when they begin to learn that, it can really change how they view the world, their understanding of the reality, of the disparity of growing up in different countries, whatever country they happen to be in, and what that looks like based on color of skin, wealth that you're born into, gender, sexuality, religion. In the US, it is assumed, particularly if you're white, but even not being white or brown even, really, you're Christian. Well, what if you're not? Our holidays, we have religious holidays based on Christianity. Schools are out. Government businesses are closed. So there's privilege in being Christian as well. How many times do people say, let's pray together? What if you don't pray? A lot of people then feel embarrassed or ashamed. What are they going to think about me if I'm not Christian? And pray like they do. Maybe you pray a different way, maybe you don't pray at all. But what if I don't pray like they do? We all, every single one of us, holds privilege in some way or another. It is important to be able to recognize that, particularly as we're having conversations about injustice in the world, in our communities, as we talk about systemic issues that perpetuate, that create those injustices. We need to have a clear understanding of that so that when we talk about it, we understand it more fully. So that when we talk about it, we know what it is we're talking about and we can see what truly needs to be changed. Because I truly do believe that at our core, if we can move past the fear, the shame, the otherness, I believe that all of us at our core want us all to be happy and whole and free. But there's so much that gets in the way. So much that gets in the way, and that can be different for so many different reasons. What it is that gets in your way specifically is going to be a little different in some ways than what gets in my way. We owe it to ourselves to understand what it is that's getting in the way, because without that, we ourselves can never truly be happy, whole, and free, because we continue to protect ourselves. We continue to judge ourselves and others. We go into that self-protective space, keeping ourselves separate from others. We all have privilege in some way. There's nothing to be ashamed of in that at all. In fact, sometimes being able to recognize the privilege that we do have, the access to things that we do have for whatever reason, we can actually use that as part of what we can feel grateful for. It's not about feeling grateful, I'm white, though depending on the circumstances, that might be something that you say or believe. But you can be grateful that you haven't had to be afraid of being pulled over by the police. You can be grateful to not go into your school classroom as the only person who looked like you and what that feels like to be that. Those kinds of things you can be grateful for. And if you can feel a sense of gratitude for those without feeling shame, and that's so important, if you can feel the gratitude from that, that can also create significant change within your being. Thank you for listening to my little lecture today. I hope that this has been helpful. I know this has been a long video, longer than I anticipated. If you're still here and listening, thank you so much. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments. even your rebuttals. If there's something that you disagree with me, I'd love to have more of a conversation around that. I think it is an important conversation to have. And of course, I couldn't cover absolutely everything. And there's going to be some nuanced pieces that people are going to react or respond to. And I'm very open to hearing what those are. So I'll look forward to hearing from you. Leave your comments, your thoughts, your reactions in the comments below. Thank you again for being part of my community and listening.